This video will show you how to graph trig functions with what we call a phase shift, which is just a fancy word for a horizontal translation of a sine or cosine wave. So far, we've looked at graphing the basic sine wave, so that's y equals sine of x. And the next thing we did was see what happened if you placed a coefficient in front of the sine x, and that changed the amplitude. It made the wave taller. And then we also looked at what happens when you, instead of putting the 2 in front of the sine, if you make it part of the argument, and then we discovered that that affects the period of the graph. Well, you'll notice that the equation here, it's not just 2x, the argument is 2x minus pi over 4. And whenever your argument involves adding or subtracting, you create a phase shift or horizontal translation. So the way we're going to graph this is, here, let me get a bigger eraser. We're going to solve two equations first, which I hope you understand why we're doing when I go to the next screen. We want to know when the argument 2x minus pi over 4 is equal to 0, because that's where one period or phase of the graph will begin when we're taking the sign of 0. So the argument 2x minus pi over 4 has to be 0. If I add pi over 4 to each side, I discover that 2x is pi over 4, and then I have to split both sides in half. Divide by 2, multiply by 1/2. However it makes the most sense to you, when you solve that, you discover that x equals pi over 8. And what that means is that a cycle will begin at x equals pi over 8. Now, in order to know where that same cycle ends, well, remember, the period of the basic sine wave goes from 0 to 2 pi. So now I need to solve the equation 2x minus pi over 4 equals 2 pi, and that will let me know where the period that began at pi over 8 actually ends. So I have to add pi over 4 to both sides. I'm going to think of 2 pi as 8 pi over 4, because when I think about it that way, I'll be able to add the pi over 4 and get 9 pi over 4. And then I have to divide both sides by 2, which might be easier to think about as multiplying both sides by 1/2, and I get x equals 9 pi over 8. So the period or cycle will end at 9 pi over 8. And that's just a really good way to start when you need to graph something that has a phase shift. It's I think the cleanest way to figure out how to do it. On this screen, I'm going to actually graph the function. But first, just a reminder of what the sine wave looks like before it's transformed, or in this case, phase shifted. And remember that we determined on the previous screen that a cycle will start at pi over 8, and it will go all the way to 9 pi over 8. So that guides me in terms of my scale. It makes sense to mark off intervals of pi over 8. So that's pi over 8. 2 pi over 8 I'm going to reduce to pi over 4. 3 pi over 8 doesn't reduce. 4 pi over 8, well, 4/8 is 1/2. 5/8 doesn't reduce. 6/8 is equal to 3/4. 7/8 doesn't reduce. 8/8 is 1 whole. And 9/8 doesn't reduce. So this will give me the space to draw one period of the graph. And look up here, sine wave, the cycle starts on the x-axis, but we've shifted it over. So now it's going to start here and end here. And notice for the sine wave, the cycle starts on the x-axis, ends on the x-axis, and halfway in between is also on the x-axis. So from pi over 8 to 9 pi over 8 on my graph is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 jumps. So halfway, 1, 2, 3, 4, is right here. And then notice that halfway between the two x-intercepts, the graph reaches its maximum of 1. So halfway between pi over 8 and 5 pi over 8 is right here at 3 pi over 8. And similar logic tells me that halfway between these two x-intercepts, the graph reaches its minimum. So that gives me enough to sketch the sine wave that has been phase shifted pi over 8 units to the right. For your homework, I want you to graph a similar function. Notice that this one does have a 2 in the front, so in addition to phase shifting this graph, the amplitude should be 2. And just a reminder that you want to solve 3x minus pi over 2 equals 0, because that will tell you where to start one cycle of this function, and then you want to solve 3x minus pi over 2 equals 2 pi to know where that cycle will end. And then of course you'll mark your scale accordingly. Do this on graph paper. Have that ready for class next time.